What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And today I'm going to start off my new segment on best characters. Couple of things. First, I'll be talking about characters that I think have the best ethical and psychological complexity. Obviously, you can be a good character without having ethical or psychological complexity, so I just want to make that clear. And the reason why I'm doing this video segment as opposed to just best characters generally is because this segment was originally requested by, I believe his name is Wolf D. Lycan or Wolf Lycan D. I can't quite remember his name, but yeah, he was the one who requested that I do this. And also, these are best characters. So it's not just restricted to shonen. I'm also going to be talking about seinen characters as well. And gotta start it off with my man Light Yagami from Death Note, the tragic villain. And this video segment has been a long time coming. Months and months and months. Been on a couple of hiatuses since I first announced this video segment. But before I get into this video specifically, I gotta clap it up for myself. Why do I have to clap it up for myself? Because this is pretty much my first anniversary, my first year anniversary on YouTube. I uploaded my first video, I believe it was October the 2nd of 2011. So I have officially been on YouTube for 1 year. So again, clap it up for me. Clap it up for me. So now getting into this video. So why Light Yagami? The one of the reasons why I chose Light Yagami, of course, I think he's one of the best villains in either shonen or seinen. One of the better characters in shonen as well. But the reason why I chose him is because he's a very, very interesting and unique character with respect to his position within the story. And here's what I mean by that. It's rather unusual for the protagonist of a series to also be the villain of the series. And in that way, Light Yagami as a character is rather unique because, as most of you guys know, although some people still might be confused by this, Light Yagami is the protagonist of Death Note, and he's also the villain, or if you will, anti-villain, and I'll get into that later on. But one thing I have to make clear before I move on into my analysis of Light Yagami is that, again, I'm talking about characters who I think who I think have the best psychological and ethical complexity. Not necessarily, again, the best characters per se in a broader sense, but the ones who I think have the best psychological and ethical complexity. And it's not that I think he's a good character because he has psychological and ethical complexity, although I think that plays a part in it when we're talking about Light Yagami's character specifically. So who is Light Yagami for those of you who don't know? Light Yagami is the main character of the manga and also the anime series Death Note, and Death Note is basically about Light Yagami. He's a genius who has what I would call an unhealthy preoccupation with the evils of the world. So someone who's overly concerned with things like justice, morality, eradicating evil, trying to make the world basically a better place. And what happens is he comes into possession of this supernatural notebook. In the Death Note manga, there are beings known as shinigamis, and they have this what's called a death note, and the way that they kill people is by writing their names in the death note. And somehow, well, not actually somehow, but a shinigami named Ryuk drops his death note, and Light Yagami comes into possession of the death note, which allows him to kill people in various ways, and there are a whole bunch of rules surrounding how he can kill people. But basically, if he knows a person's face, so he can visualize their face, and then he writes their name in the notebook, then he can basically kill them with the notebook. And it starts off with him using the Death Note to kill criminals, and as the story progresses, it escalates to the point where he's not only killing criminals in his quest to rid the world of evil and to make the world a more just place, but he starts killing anybody who basically gets in his way. So if you get in Light Yagami's way, you gotta die. It's basically as simple as that. And so the rest of the manga, the rest of the anime series is basically a story chronicling how Light has to duel with L, the antagonist of the series, who's in some ways, I'd probably consider him to be an anti-hero. So it chronicles the duel with L, who's trying to stop Light Yagami from using the Death Note to kill people. And like I said before, I think one of the reasons why I chose Light Yagami is because of how interesting and how unique his character position is, because he's the protagonist as well as the sort of tragic villain and anti-villain and main character of the series. So originally I was supposed to do Death Note versus Code Geass, the versus match for the Cloud Village, and then, well, I never got around to doing that video, obviously, and then I was going to do just a review of Death Note, and then since I had this series of best characters, I figured why not do an analysis and character profile of Light Yagami. And a couple of days ago, actually, I was watching Larry's video on his anime favorites of Death Note, and he mentioned in there that Light Yagami was a tragic villain. And I had originally never thought of Light Yagami as a tragic villain. I just always thought of him as just a straight up or straightforward villain. But then as I started to think about it, I realized that Light Yagami actually is a tragic villain, which sort of adds a dimension to his psychological complexity, because he's not really a straightforward villain. And here's what I mean by a tragic villain. A tragic villain is generally they are villains, but they tend to be victims of circumstances. So they're not generally evil by choice, but there's some circumstance or some situation in which they find themselves that forces them to be evil or leads them down a path of darkness. And this is a classic example. In this sense, Light is a tragic villain because he originally didn't start off as a villain when Death Note starts. The reason why he becomes a villain is because he comes into possession of the Shinigami notebook, the Death Note. And in that sense, as a villain, he's somewhat unconventional in that sense. And so what happens is that the Death Note, the Shinigami notebook, is used as a plot device, which pretty much magnifies all of his pathologies. His God complex. If he would have never gotten that notebook, he would have never developed his God complex. He would have never developed his overwhelming sense of narcissism, and he would have never developed such a warped sense of justice, and he eventually would not have become a sociopath. So in the sense that he just happened to come upon the Death Note, he is a victim of circumstance, and he is led down the path of darkness, not by his own choice, but by the fact that he comes into this supernatural power. And but it's also interesting in the sense that a tragic villain is generally, like I said before, a character who is not evil by choice, and yet, because Light Yagami is a sociopath, and he definitely chooses to do what he does, and he doesn't have a conscience that tells him not to do this or not to do that, because that would be wrong. In that sense, he's also not a tragic villain. So I think it's very interesting that that Light Yagami is a character who sort of skirts the boundaries between being a tragic villain on one hand, because the fact that he comes into possession of the Shinigami notebook is just mere coincidence, and he's also not a tragic villain in the sense that he is evil by choice, that he actually chooses to do these things, and he's not really forced to do them. So here's where I think a lot of his complexity comes in. It starts with the fact that he's a tragic villain, but a lot of his complexity also comes from the fact that he is an anti-villain. And what's really, really interesting is that I'm not sure if I've ever come across a character who was a tragic villain and an anti-villain simultaneously. That's a very, very unique occurrence to me. I don't think I've ever come across that. And the reason why I say he's also an anti-villain, and not just that he's an anti-villain, but he's also an anti-villain because he's a tragic villain. Because what gets the ball rolling is the fact that he happens to come into possession of the Death Note. And the reason why I say he's an anti-villain is because, and I've talked about anti-villains before, basically a villain is an evil character, and there's two ways that you can be evil. You can be evil either through your goals, so you can have a goal that's evil, or you can be evil in your methods. The means by which you achieve your goals could be evil, even though your goals are not necessarily evil. So straightforward villains are always evil in pretty much both ways. They have evil objectives and they have evil ways of obtaining their objectives. Anti-villains, on the other hand, are not straightforwardly evil characters because they're only evil either in their objectives or they're evil in the way that they go about achieving their objectives. And what also makes an anti-villain is the fact that they have some heroic traits. They have some heroic personality traits. And Light Yagami fits this pretty much perfectly. Light Yagami, like I said before, when we first see him, he's not a sociopath, and he's a very noble person. He wants to create a just world. He wants to eradicate evil. He possesses all of the attributes that we would consider to be virtuous, empathy, things of that sort. But when he comes into possession of the Death Note, that's when he starts down his path of darkness. But he always, even though he becomes a sociopath in his methods and in his motives, because he gets this massive God complex, even though in the end he becomes a tragic villain and the reason why he remains an anti-villain rather than a straight-up villain is because he never, even though his sense of justice becomes warped, he becomes warped. He never loses the fact that he wants the world to be a just place, that he wants it to be a moral place. And in that sense, he always continues to possess certain noble attributes, certain noble objectives. And like I said before, the Death Note really functions as a plot device which magnifies certain aspects of his personality that lead him to become evil. So what we see as his self-confidence at the beginning of the series turns into a massive amount of arrogance. His genius and cunning, rather than being used to make the world a better place, he now uses it to manipulate people, even his closest friends and his family. And the ambition that he had at the beginning of the series is now transformed into basically a God complex. And so the Death Note in the series is not just a plot device that magnifies these sort of pathologies, but it's also a symbol of how power corrupts humans and does so by magnifying their narcissism. And that's precisely what happens to Light Yagami. The fact that his narcissism becomes so large is what warps his sense of justice. And so Light Yagami as a protagonist, we can see that the fact that he's a protagonist allows for a deeper level of characterization because most of the focus is always on Light Yagami, and the focus is on how the Death Note becomes a plot device to magnify his pathologies, and it becomes a symbol of how power corrupts human beings by warping their sense of justice and causing their narcissism to basically get way, way, way out of hand. So in that sense, Light Yagami is an anti-villain because he's a tragic villain. So in that sense, he has a lot of psychological and ethical complexity. And I think it's one of the especially in shonen. I won't go so far as to say in seinen, but definitely in shonen, it's one of the best examples of how humans get warped and corrupted by power. And that's precisely what happens to Light Yagami. The one thing, or rather the one problem I have with Light Yagami's character is a sort of character inconsistency. Before Light Yagami gets the Death Note, like I said before, he was not a sociopath. He didn't have a god complex, and he didn't really want to kill all these people. He was really a noble person. But after he gets the Death Note, he basically becomes a sociopath, and this really shouldn't be possible. It's really not plausible. And the reason why I say this is because in real life, people don't just become sociopaths. You can start off as a person who generally is not a nice person, who generally doesn't respect the rights of other people, which is a classic sign of sociopathy. But you don't go from being a normal person to a sociopath. It's generally a scale of escalation. But in Light Yagami's case, there's never a scale of escalation. It's just he goes from a normal person to a sociopath. And one of the things that is indicative of a sociopath is that you have to have a certain pattern of behavior of being cruel to other people, of violating other people's rights, of manipulating and using people. That's what starts you off on the path of sociopathy. And then you escalate that pattern of behavior. But like I said before, Light Yagami was a completely normal person before he found the Death Note. So I find that to be somewhat of a character inconsistency. And also you see this when he loses his memories and he reverts back into that normal person. So again, that shows you that he's was always set up to be a character who was an anti-villain, because he always keeps those noble aspirations. But when he loses his memories, all of a sudden he goes from being a sociopath into a normal person, and that really shouldn't be possible. So that was just the one thing, or the one problem I had with Light Yagami in terms of character inconsistency. But with respect to everything else, I think that his psychological complexity resides in the fact that he's a anti-villain because he's a tragic villain. And he's tragic in the sense that he just happens to come upon this Death Note, and even though he always kept his very noble aspirations, he allowed the power of the Death Note to corrupt him and to warp his sense of justice, which eventually led to him becoming an anti-villain. So look forward to more videos in this series, and I'm pretty sure that my next video is going to be on the big bad himself, Char Aznavour. Yeah, from Gundam. I have to do Char Aznavour next. Char Aznavour is probably the best character certainly the best character I've ever seen in shonen. Just me personally, in my opinion. Definitely the best character in shonen, and possibly the best character I've ever seen, even including seinen. So watch out for that video on Char Aznavour. But this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.